No. This has continued as the golden thread of history, as Nehru himself, the Prime Minister of India, called it. In all the dark moments of our life, private and public, in all the great tragedies of the world, we look back to that one brief shining month where several thousand poorly armed Jews held off the biggest military force assembled in the history of man, longer than any national government or army, including that of France, which at that time, at the time of the Battle of France, had 200,000 more troops than the Germans. Edelman was once asked, and I mention Edelman because he was the last of the survivors, about miracles. He said, I don't know about miracles. I know what I can do about deciding my life. And that's what we talked about as a group. It didn't matter, because even the more religious ones, we turned to and we said, if you believe in your faith, if you believe in your God, if you believe there's intervention in our lives, do something about it. You're a partner with God. You can't just rely on God. He did this too. Today God is here, tomorrow God is there. So it's not good enough that the lessons drawn from the Holocaust are, it's a terrible thing and we were innocent and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again, because as General Mackenzie keeps reminding audiences everywhere, it happens everywhere. It happens in big ways like Rwanda and Bosnia and Chechnya, and in other ways from Hungary in 1956 to Czechoslovakia in 1967. It happens everywhere. We will not ever see or realize mankind's transcendent yearning for redemptive change. We will be able to, however, every day help people, help ourselves, stand up for an ideal, and live our lives with dignity. You know, this month didn't just start with Yom HaShoah. This month, for me, started on April 4th at a commemoration of the life of Martin Luther King. He was assassinated 50 years ago on April 4th. And one of the proudest things I've done in my life is work with the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, get 25 Montreal cops fired or suspended for racism, and be awarded a Martin Luther King Jr. award. And King, nonviolent Martin Luther King, at a Harvard speech, used the Warsaw Ghetto as message and metaphor. That it's not how many you are, that it's not how well armed you are. It's your will. It's what you are. That's the lessons of today. That's the lessons that these people taught us. And more. And more. Israel had a crisis in the early 60s. It was phenomenal. It's not talked about very much anymore. But it had a massive psychological crisis. The first generation of children of survivors were going into the army. And they had a problem. Es ist gewesen eine Frage. The children asked their parents, why didn't you fight? How many know how many Nazi troops rounded up 4 million Jews in Poland and Russia? Anybody know?
Probably 0.
4 million in 60 days. How many troops did it take? 250,000. That was it. There was a schism. There was a fracture. Parents didn't know how to answer. Our answer is today. That's why the Yom HaGevurah today, it's not just the Warsaw Ghetto was the Gevurah, the strength, the heroes. That's our answer. I want to take you for a little moment back in history. I want you to think of what I'm about to tell you. Jedem Tag, ich trug mit dir a medallion. I presume everybody understands Yiddish, or most people. When I finished my service in Israel, I was given this. And I carry it with me every day. And it's a relief of Masada. And the words above it say, Masada shuv lotipol. Masada shall not fall again. What does that mean? It doesn't mean just that the third Jewish commonwealth will not fall. We're all dedicated to the third Jewish commonwealth not falling. But people forget something about Masada. Masada was not just a place where some 960 Jewish zealots killed themselves rather than be taken captive by the Romans after the fall of Jerusalem. Masada had actually been captured by what we could call as Jewish commandos before the 900 came up there. That was year 70 of the Common Era. That was the fall of Jerusalem. For 2,000 years, Jews did not fight. We're not talking about individual Jews being heroic in somebody else's army. We're talking about Jews saying, for all our wonderful philosophy, there comes a time to confront total evil. 2,000 years, my friends, from Masada to the ghetto. And the calls of the words of the Warsaw Ghetto. You know, today, tank officers take their oaths on top of Masada. And they pledge that Metzada shuv lo tipol. But there are other words in that oath. There are other words in that oath that come from the words and the writings of Mordechai Levitz and Marek Edelman and Emanuel Ringelbaum and the diaries that were found. And among the words in that oath, we shall be among the 1 in 1,000 who will not cater to masters. We shall determine our fate. The Gevurah. That's what separates this day. That's what makes this day a necessity. No, this is not a day when, with all due respect to my friends Anthony and Lawrence, this is not a day when heads of state will promise never again. This is a day we're taught, as by the sages, that Jews are people of convenience. We're people from the inside. We don't need anybody telling us this will not be done again. We need to tell ourselves that we have the will to stand up with our last breath, regardless of age, regardless of ability, to fight for ourselves. The Jewish army, the Israeli army, is not 200,000 people. It is the Sharit Israel, it is the remnant of 13 million. That's the lesson of Yom V'Gevurah. That's the lesson of these people. What you see in front of me is a poster I brought with me. You have to understand the lesson of the ghetto is transnational. Many of you, most of you, should have seen the iconic poster of the Holocaust, of the Warsaw Ghetto, sorry. The one with the woman with the gun and the rabbi here and the little child there. That was painted after the war by a man named Christos Stefanov. The woman in the portrait was his wife. It is part of a triptych. There are 3 of them. This is a second. The young boy behind the old man was Stefanov's son, who was killed in Auschwitz. Stefanov was a Bulgarian Catholic who fought on the other side of the ghetto. He found himself in Warsaw. He smuggled weapons into the Jewish fighters. He was rounded up. He was taken to Auschwitz. After the war, he made his way first to the Netherlands, where Queen Beatrix made him a painter of the royal court, and then he came to Montreal in the 50s. He set up an artist village in Saint Adèle. And 2 weeks after the Quebec government had announced the expansion of his work, Paul-Émile Cardinal-Léger had commissioned him for a portrait. He died of a massive heart attack. His late wife never touched a thing in the house or the studio from the day that was taken to the hospital. His painting corner is as it is. You can go see it. Stefanov's work, and he had his Auschwitz garb, and he made an artwork out of that. Stefanov's work went around the world. He also felt guilt because his father didn't do enough, he felt. He didn't do enough. When I started with Irwin, the year and a half that I was Irwin's exec, it was before he was Minister of Justice, it was 99, I got a visit from a young Polish painter, Jerzy Celemencki. And I helped him out with something that he needed, and he brought in a painting. And the painting was Anna Levitz's face in the middle, the picture of the little boy with his arms up in the bottom left of the canvas, flames behind them, taking them to heaven. And he said, I wanted you to have this. It's one of dozens that I've done. I said, why are you painting this? He said, because my father was in the non-Jewish underground. And he, on his deathbed, told me he didn't do enough to help the Jews. This is my way of making it up. The story of the ghetto is real. We can talk about the Holocaust, and we need to. And we all remember the faces. I lost 70 members of my family in the Holocaust. But the faces of the ghetto resistance goes beyond just us. It gives hope and gave hope to persecuted blacks in the American South. It gives hope to persecuted peoples in Africa and Asia. Believe me, the story is known. This story shall you tell your children. And tragically, in the pendulum of history, reading 2 weeks ago that 60% of millennials have heard the word Holocaust and can recognize it. 40% of millennials heard the word Auschwitz and can recognize it. God help us how few millennials would have heard the words of the Warsaw Ghetto. But that is our responsibility. Zichron, memory, the memory and witness, because the Warsaw Ghetto is alive yesterday, today, and it's our responsibility to make it alive tomorrow. And I want to close on one note. There are different kinds, when I said ich bin a Kind in the Ghetto Warsaw, there are different kinds of first-generation survivor children. I belong to a small little niche of them. We're children of fighter survivors. My father, his 3 brothers, 2 of their cousins, and a friend fought, 7 men fought in 5 Allied forces, including the Jewish brigades. And the only member of that generation that was lost was my aunt. She decided to stay with my grandfather. My grandfather was a very well-respected leader in a province called Volyn, one of the 4 interwar provinces of Poland. There was Congress Poland, Lesser Poland, Volyn, and Podolia. And the synagogue that he went to, it was a very formal place, was the synagogue where King Sigismund III had emancipated the Jews of Poland in the 14th century and allowed the Jews to build a fort around the synagogue. You can see a picture of that synagogue on the back cover of Sir Martin Gilbert's Atlas of European History. And my father and his brothers had left Poland for France after the First World War. They were very successful. They were very engagés. But their sister stayed. And my grandfather refused all calls to come to France. He said, what's going to happen to him? Business with the Radziwills. The Radziwills are the royal family of Poland. They control sugar. My grandfather had sugar beet plantations. What could happen? 18 months after that, he was dead. The Radziwills were dead. But between the two, the cities around Lvov, all the attacks into Poland came by Einsatzgruppen. And in Lvov, so Warsaw was Einsatzgruppe A and B, participated in the original attacks. When you go further south and west, in what was Lemberg, Silesia, the German part, it was Einsatzgruppe D. So they came in to Lvov, and they had the biggest massacre of Jews outside of Babi Yar. When I say massacre, I mean pits, open pit. So Babi Yar has 36,000 bodies. Palanta Hill has 19,000. But the Germans, the Gestapo, wanted to round up the political Jews. And my aunt was a labor organizer. Hashemer Hatzir, but then went over to the Bund. Her boyfriend, my father's best friend, was a man named David Prinzenthal. They were both arrested. They weren't even put into Ghetto Lutsk. They were politically arrested, taken out after a week of torture. She was raped. She had her cuts on her skin, cigarette burns, the whole 9 yards. And David told Rita, when you hear the crack of the bullets, fall to the ground, the bodies will cover us, because the guys doing the shooting were Ukrainians sitting on the ground with Sten guns like this, with Nazi officers and a bottle of vodka. That's what they did. They crawled out at night. David went across Poland, Bulgaria, Romania, got to Palestine at that time. By the end of 1943, lifelong career officer in the Haganah, ended up as a colonel. He was secretary of a kibbutz called Malach HaMisha, and founded the Soviet Public Committee for Soviet Jewry, which, by the way, the first committees for Soviet Jewry were started by the Workers' Circle and the Bund in New York. But my aunt wanted to find my grandfather. And she went back into town, and she heard that he was hiding in a cellar. And she found him. And she told him what happened. And the cellar was in the Lutz ghetto, which was much smaller than Warsaw, but the experiences are the same. A few days after that, a couple shows up at the storm cellar doors carrying a baby. And a lot of the adults in the cellar didn't want to take in these three people because babies cried. And my grandfather said, I have led you before, we will live and we will die together. 3 days later, the baby cried. Storm cellar doors were open, the Nazis came in. As they were leading everybody out, my grandfather killed his daughter and killed himself with a Shabbat knife. No, don't toy. No. Wrong reaction. They determine their life and they determine their death. Because in speaking to two survivors of that cellar, both my aunt and my grandfather would not go through. Not the pain of death. They knew that death was coming. The indignity of having someone else decide. We decide. That's our message. We fought. We continue to fight. Whatever happens. Not because we're chosen, and not because God's on our side, that we hope he is, or she is, or they are. And not because we're right about everything. We are one thing in the history of man. And particularly since the day in the 17th century when Baruch Spinoza came out of that synagogue in Amsterdam and the Jews went onto the stage of history after 1,500 years. We're the canary. We are entitled to respect precisely because, not because we're many, not because we're right, and not because we're always so polite, but precisely because we're few and we're stubborn and we're irritating. But you know what? As long as we don't bother anybody else, the litmus test of the world's civility and of all the pretty words of politicians have to pass that test, that they will respect the right of the few and the irritating and the stubborn and the brave. And that's what we celebrate today. And that's the pride we walk away from these ceremonies in remembering these people and these heroes. Thank you.